Hey everyone, welcome back. We're doing a deep dive today into, well, it's something I think we're all thinking about,
Yeah.
especially with how the economy's going right now. Government spending.
It's a hot topic.
Yeah, like how is the government spending money?
Yeah.
What are they doing with our money?
Definitely top of mind for a lot of people.
Exactly. So we found this news segment that's been going around,
Okay.
and it highlights some really surprising ways that the U.S. government has been spending funds.
Oh, wow.
And it's really sparked some interesting discussion about waste and efficiency.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So to give you a taste, we're talking about things like, funding going to a Russian lab to experiment on cat brains.
What?
Yeah. We've got studies on whether tequila makes sunfish more aggressive,
Okay.
and even the IRS owing millions of dollars in back taxes.
Oh, wow. That's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, there's a lot. So
Wow.
let's just jump right in. This news segment kind of does a rundown of a bunch of examples,
Okay.
but some of them really stood out.
All right.
So one example is that $550,000 went to a Russian lab for experiments on cat brains,
Wow.
and that was funded by the National Institutes of Health.
Okay. So, I guess my first question is, why?
Right.
Why are we spending so much money on this kind of research, especially when there's so many other needs here in the U.S.?
Right, and that's just one example.
Oh,
There's a study on monkeys and gambling.
really?
Yeah. The State Department gave money for drag shows in Ecuador.
Wow.
I know.
That raises some questions about how those spending decisions are made.
Yeah, and last year Senator James Lankford in a House hearing
Okay.
brought up some more of these examples.
Okay.
He talked about those grants for drag shows in
Yeah,
Ecuador,
right.
an NSS study on butterflies in Europe,
Hmm.
and even funding for a Beatles exhibit in Brooklyn.
For the Beatles.
Yeah, for Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Wow. So it sounds like they're funding a really wide range of projects.
Yeah, and some of them seem
It's questionable.
yeah, a little more questionable than others.
Yeah.
So there's more. A $350,000 grant to study smart toilets.
Smart toilets.
Yes. Research on soundscapes in colonial Mexico,
Soundscapes.
and a study on whether helmets and seatbelts are actually effective in Ghana.
Wait, do we really need to spend money to figure out if helmets and seatbelts work? I mean, I feel like that's pretty well established.
I would think so, but maybe they're looking at it in a different context.
Maybe there are unique factors in Ghana that could teach us something new about safety strategies.
Yeah, you're right. It could be something like that.
Yeah.
It's just one of those things that when you see it, you're like, huh,
Yeah, I get it.
okay. And it doesn't stop there. $100,000 to find out if tequila or gin makes sunfish more aggressive.
Okay, that one I kind of want to know the answer to.
Me too. Then $1 million to study if selfies make you happy. Research on the difference between the mating calls of country versus city frogs.
Wow.
And a whopping $12 million spent by the University of Mississippi on monkeys and meth.
Monkeys and meth. What is going on?
I know. It's a lot.
Yep.
And, and to add to all of this, the news segment reported that the IRS,
Oh, no.
the agency that collects our taxes,
Yeah.
had employees who owed millions in back taxes.
Oh, the irony.
I know, right? Between 2021 and 2023.
That's not a good look.
Not at all.
Yeah.
So here we have this list of all this government spending.
Right.
Some of it's pretty out there.
Yeah.
Is it really just a bunch of wasted money? Or is there some value in these projects that we're just not seeing?
That's a great question. And I think it's important to remember that government funding covers so many different things.
Yeah.
From research to cultural programs to infrastructure to social services.
Right.
So trying to define what counts as waste is tricky.
Yeah.
It really depends on your values and priorities.
Sure.
So some of these projects might seem pointless at first glance, but others could have some benefit that we don't see right now. It could be scientific or cultural or even economic.
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's hard to say for sure. It's definitely about perspective, I think.
Yeah. Right. Because on the one hand, you have these projects that seem,
Weird.
yeah, kind of out there.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, they could have some value that we just don't know about yet.
Exactly.
Like this news segment we're talking about.
Yeah.
They really are painting a picture of widespread waste and inefficiency in the government.
Right. And I think that's a sentiment that a lot of people share.
Yeah.
Especially these days.
Especially with people struggling right now.
Yeah, when people are having a hard time making ends meet and then they see their tax dollars going to things that seem frivolous,
Yeah.
it's understandable why they'd be upset.
Exactly. And the news segment really plays into that.
Yeah.
They use this language like, we can't afford groceries, but they're funding drag shows in Ecuador,
Yeah.
and that really hits a nerve with people.
It does, because it makes you feel like your priorities and the government's priorities are completely misaligned.
Yeah, like how do they even decide what to cut?
That's a million-dollar question. And the source material doesn't really give a clear answer. But they do present a couple of approaches.
Right.
One idea is that we need like a fundamental shift in how we see the government.
Okay, so what does that look like? What does that shift actually look like in practice?
Well, they talk about like disentangling ourselves from a government that's committed to opacity.
Committed to opacity. So like
It's a fancy way of saying
it's like a secret.
that the government's too big, too complex, not transparent enough.
So it's like trying to navigate a maze, but you're blindfolded.
Exactly. You don't know where you're going or what you're going to run into.
Right. And if you can't see anything, how can you hold anyone accountable?
Right. Exactly.
Okay, so how do we fix that?
Well, they bring up this idea from Vivek Ramaswamy and Elon Musk
Oh, yeah.
about a Department of Government, or DOGE.
Right. And their big thing was cutting the career civil service,
Yes. Getting rid of a lot of those long-term government employees.
which sparked a lot of controversy.
It did. Because they're basically arguing that these career bureaucrats, as they call them, are the problem.
Right.
They say they create this system that's just bloated and inefficient.
And they even brought up those leaks from the Trump administration.
Yes, suggesting that career civil servants were actively working against the president.
It's interesting.
It is an interesting argument, and it definitely plays into a certain distrust of the establishment.
Right, but I mean, are all career civil servants bad?
Mm.
Like there has to be good, hardworking people in there too.
Of
Right?
course, it's important not to generalize.
Right.
Not all career civil servants are incompetent or disloyal.
And wouldn't getting rid of all that experience create a huge knowledge gap?
That's a big concern that critics bring up.
Yeah.
They argue that you need that experience for the government to function properly.
Right.
Getting rid of all those people could lead to chaos and instability.
Yeah. Not more efficiency,
Right.
which is what Ramaswamy and Musk say they want.
I do.
And it could open the door to more corruption, right? If you're just putting people into positions based on loyalty instead of merit.
Absolutely. That's always a risk.
So it's a tricky situation.
It is. It's not as simple as just firing everyone.
So if that's not the solution, what is?
Well, the news segment talks about a different approach.
Okay.
They call it the scalpel, not shovel method.
Right. So instead of like this huge overhaul,
Yeah,
they're talking about making these smaller targeted cuts over time.
exactly.
Okay.
The idea is that even small cuts can add up to big savings if you do it consistently.
It's like taking care of the pennies and the dollars will take care of themselves.
Precisely. But, like we said earlier, the tricky part is figuring out where to cut.
Right. Because you don't want to cut something essential.
Exactly. You need to really understand how the government programs work and what the consequences would be.
Boy, that's hard.
It's not about cutting randomly.
Yeah.
It's about being strategic and informed.
So we've got these two contrasting approaches. The complete overhaul versus the targeted cuts. Is there like a middle ground?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Maybe the best way is to kind of combine the two.
Okay.
Well, maybe there are some areas where a big restructuring makes sense.
Like agencies that are clearly bloated or inefficient.
Exactly. And then for other areas, you could use the scalpel approach.
Then trim the fat.
Right. And redirect those resources to more important programs.
So basically choose the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And be flexible.
And I think a big part of this is making sure everything's transparent.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Maintaining public trust is crucial.
Yeah.
And that only happens if the government is open and honest about how they're using our money.
Okay, so we've talked about cutting programs, but what about making more money?
That's a whole other conversation.
But it's an important one, right?
It is.
They can't just ignore it.
Especially if we're serious about tackling government spending.
Yeah, because people always say it's either cut programs or raise taxes.
Right.
But what if there's another way?
It would be great if we could find a way to make more money without putting a bigger burden on taxpayers.
Yeah, are there any ideas about how to do that?
Well, this news segment doesn't really go into specific solutions.
It is a news segment.
It's not like a deep dive into economic policy.
True.
But I think the main takeaway is that people are frustrated.
Yeah.
They're frustrated with the waste they see in government.
Right.
And maybe we can channel that frustration into something positive.
Like having a conversation about how to make the system better.
Exactly.
So how do we do that? Where do we even begin?
Well, first of all, I think we need to recognize that there's no quick fix.
No magic bullet.
No, government spending is a really complex issue,
Yeah.
and there are always going to be these competing interests.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we should just give up.
No.
It means we need to be more informed and more engaged.
And hold our elected officials accountable.
Exactly.
Okay.
And maybe we can shift the conversation away from blame and frustration.
Towards finding solutions.
Yes, working together to create a government that's truly responsive to the needs of its people.
And uses our hard-earned tax dollars wisely.
Absolutely. So we spent a lot of time talking about government spending.
Yeah, we've gone through a lot.
From those crazy examples to all the different ways to tackle waste.
It's been a journey for sure.
It really has. And, it's made me think about how this isn't just about budgets and numbers.
It's about values.
Yeah.
What we prioritize as a society.
Exactly. So that brings us to the big question.
Yeah.
What can we actually do about it? We've talked about transparency and accountability, but how do we make that happen?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because it's about moving beyond just ideas.
Right.
And thinking about concrete action.
So, what can we actually do? What are some things that we can start doing right now?
Well, I think it all starts with education.
Okay.
We need to understand the basics.
Like how does the budget process actually work?
Okay.
Where does the money come from? How is it allocated?
So you're saying we all need to become budget experts?
No, not exactly. You don't need a degree in economics to get it.
Okay.
There are a ton of resources online that break down the budget in a way that's easy to understand.
Okay. So once we've learned the basics, then what?
Then it's time to make our voices heard.
How?
Contact your representatives.
Okay.
Go to town hall meetings, participate in public forums.
Right.
Basically, let them know that you're paying attention to how they're spending your tax dollars.
Yeah, show them that we care.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of collective action.
Like, what do you mean?
Join or support organizations that advocate for fiscal responsibility and government transparency.
Right.
Because when people come together and speak with one voice, it can really make a difference.
So it's about getting involved on a bigger scale.
Exactly. And we also need to hold people accountable.
Like the people in power?
Yeah. How do we make sure they're actually listening to our concerns and acting on them?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, that's where voting comes in.
Of course.
And campaign finance reform.
Right.
We need to support candidates who actually care about responsible spending.
And transparency.
Yeah, and we need to reduce the influence of special interest groups.
Who are pushing their own agendas.
Exactly. So it's not just about individual actions, it's also about systemic change.
Right. Creating a political environment where fiscal responsibility is actually a priority.
Exactly.
It all goes back to what we were talking about before about changing our mindset.
Yeah.
We're not just victims of government waste.
We can do something about it.
We're citizens who have a voice.
And a responsibility to make the government work better.
This whole conversation reminds me of a podcast I've been listening to.
Oh, yeah. What's it called?
It's called Standing in the Gaps.
Okay.
And they focus on social justice issues and how to make a positive impact in our communities.
That sounds really interesting.
It is. And they're actually running a GoFundMe campaign right now to expand their reach.
That's great.
Yeah. And I think our listeners might be interested in checking them out.
Especially the ones who are passionate about government accountability.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So if you want to learn more about Standing in the Gaps,
Yeah.
we'll put a link to their GoFundMe in the show notes.
That's awesome.
So yeah, that about wraps up our deep dive into government spending.
Wow.
We covered a lot of ground,
We did.
but hopefully you found it informative and maybe even inspiring.
It's a complex issue, but it's important to stay engaged.
And keep asking those tough questions.
Absolutely.
And remember,
Yeah,
you have the power to make a difference.
you do.